A racist police officer assaults and humiliates a black army general without knowing his true identity, but regrets it deeply when he discovers who he is. The sun was beginning to set over the city of Middleton, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. William Davis, a respected army officer, was driving his luxury car down the main avenue, enjoying a moment of tranquility after a military ceremony. He turned on the radio, letting the music fill the air, relaxing to the smooth melody of jazz. The traffic was heavy, but with an excellent sound system and a picturesque view around him, he felt at peace. However, his calm was about to be shattered. In a police cruiser, Captain John Miller observed the scene as part of his patrol. It was just another day, but a feeling of unease accompanied him. As he looked out the window, his gaze landed on William, who was driving carefreely. The sight of such a luxurious car in an area typically associated with working-class individuals sparked a primitive instinct in John. "What's a guy like him doing here?" he thought, implicit disdain coloring his reflections. He decided he needed to make a stop. With a determined expression, John pressed the accelerator and directed the cruiser toward William's car. He positioned himself authoritatively, turning on the emergency lights, while his mind formulated a scenario of confrontation. "This guy isn't going to get away with this. I'll show him who's in charge here," he murmured to himself, already preparing for what he considered a necessary intervention. William, noticing the flashing lights behind him, felt a wave of confusion. He pulled over, and as he turned off the music, wondered what could be happening. "Maybe it's a mistake," he thought, stepping out of the car with his military ID in hand, ready to clarify the situation. But as he opened the door, he was met with John's contemptuous glare. "Get out of the car now," John ordered, his voice laden with authority. He approached quickly, hand resting on his belt where his gun was holstered. William, still surprised, hesitated for a moment. "Excuse me, officer, but what's happening?" "I'm an army officer," William explained, trying to maintain his composure. John's expression didn't change, and he seemed more interested in asserting power than listening. "I don't care what you think you are. You don't belong here, and I'm going to make sure you understand that," John replied, his tone harsh and filled with disdain. William felt his blood boil, but he took a deep breath, knowing that any exaggerated reaction could escalate the situation. He didn't want to cause trouble. He just wanted to resolve this quickly. "I just want to understand why you're stopping me." "I'm just heading home," William said, keeping his voice steady, though a tremor betrayed the escalating tension within him. Ignoring the military ID that William still held, John began to cuff him. "Don't move. You're being detained on suspicion of driving a stolen vehicle," he shouted, as a small crowd of onlookers began to gather, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. John's contempt was evident, reflecting not only his prejudice, but also a need to reaffirm his authority. "This is ridiculous. I have the right to be treated with respect," William insisted, his voice now firmer, though humiliation began to seep into his mind. He glanced around, noticing the curious stares and recordings. "I really don't deserve this," he thought, his heart heavy with the injustice of the situation. "Respect? Respect is something you need to earn, and you're far from it, soldier. Now sit tight and don't make me waste any more time," John shot back, completely oblivious to the pain he was causing. William felt a wave of indignation and sadness wash over him, but he knew he had to hold it together. He was about to become yet another victim of a system that silenced him, while humiliation and prejudice intertwined, forming a web of injustice that would become impossible to ignore. Tension hung in the air around the luxury vehicle William was driving. The loud music enveloped the environment, almost like a shield against the reality surrounding him. He hadn't realized he was approaching a patrolled area, unaware of the police presence until the siren blared, cutting through the melody that William furrowed his brow, surprised, and slowly reduced his speed, pulling over to the side of the road. The sun glinted off the windows as he tried to comprehend the situation. Outside, Captain John Miller had made up his mind. He needed to approach that luxury car. He firmly believed that a vehicle like that couldn't belong to someone like William. With an authoritative posture, John exited the cruiser, adjusting his belt and placing a hand on his gun holster, as if preparing for confrontation. He approached William's car, confidence etched on his face. "Get out of the car now," John ordered, his voice dripping with contempt and anger. The tone was sharp, as if he were dealing with a highly dangerous criminal. William, confused and dazed, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "What's going on here, officer? "I haven't done anything wrong," he replied, trying to remain calm and courteous, even in the face of hostility. He knew that the best way to handle the situation was to avoid reacting aggressively. John was uninterested in William's words. "ID, now!" The way he spoke was laden with a prejudice William had encountered before. He felt as if he were being judged not only for his actions, but for who he was. With a slow movement, William reached for his wallet in the glove compartment and presented his military identification. "General William Davis, huh? What's a general like you doing driving this car? Think you can just cruise through here and hide behind a uniform?" John said, frustration escalating in his voice. He completely ignored the ID as if it meant nothing. The disdain in John's eyes was palpable, and the group of onlookers gathering around began filming, capturing every moment of the "I'm an army officer. I'm just trying to get home," William said, his voice trembling slightly. He felt powerless, as if all his achievements and respect had been dismantled in a matter of minutes. "Please, you don't need to do this." But John was determined to continue his show. "Shut up, you don't have the right to speak here. Now get out of the car," he ordered, as he pulled the handcuffs from his belt with a sudden motion. "Thorstein." William looked around, feeling the pressure of the crowd, which was now watching every movement with intense scrutiny. The look of disdain that John shot him felt like a direct blow to his dignity. Reluctantly, William opened the door and stepped out of the car, the cold handcuffs being placed on his wrists. He felt humiliation rising up his spine as John's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't belong here, General. What are you doing here, driving that car?" The words were venomous, and William struggled against the urge to retaliate. "I belong to this country as much as you do," William replied, his voice filled with fervor, although fear and sadness churned within his chest. But to John those words were irrelevant. "Shut your mouth and walk, you're under arrest," the officer shouted, as the laughter and murmurs of the crowd grew louder. William felt the stares, the mockery, and the disbelief. He was being treated like a criminal, and indignation welled up inside him. What should have been a moment of peace after a military ceremony had turned into a nightmare. He looked to the crowd, searching for support, but found only curious and indifferent faces. The internal struggle between maintaining his dignity and reacting to the insults became increasingly unbearable. He knew he had to stay strong, but the pain of humiliation followed him like a shadow. Before we continue with this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and let us know in the comments what city you're watching this video from. As John dragged him toward the police car, William made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this moment define who he was. The fight was just beginning, and he refused to become a silent victim. Tension still hung in the air as William was taken to the precinct, his heart heavy with the humiliation he had just endured. Each step toward the entrance of the building seemed to echo John Miller's cruel words in his mind. "You don't belong here," the phrase resonated, and indignation mixed with pain as he wondered how someone could possess such ignorance and disdain. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was cold and impersonal, the smell of disinfectant mingling with the palpable tension. William was led into a small windowless room where he sat at the table, trying to maintain his composure. His military uniform, which had always represented honor and dignity, now felt like a burden, a reminder that the respect he had earned over the years could be dismantled in an instant. "Are you okay, sir?" asked a younger officer who seemed genuinely concerned. William looked up, recognizing the solidarity in the man's gaze, but the humiliation still overwhelmed him. "I don't know," he replied, his voice choked. "I think I'm just trying to understand why this happened." "Don't worry, I'll talk to the sergeant," said the officer, leaving the room. William was alone for a few moments, his thoughts drifting between feelings of anger and sadness. He thought of his wife, how she must be worried, and how this experience could affect their lives. Meanwhile, in the booking area, John Miller was boasting about his great approach to his colleagues, unaware that he was about to face the consequences of his actions. The police chief, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, entered the room, his presence instantly making the atmosphere more serious. "Miller," he called, causing John to turn, the smile disappearing from his face. "So you know who this man is that you just brought in, don't you?" John crossed his arms, a look of disdain still on his face. "He's just a guy in an expensive car. I don't think he belongs here," he replied, arrogance evident in his voice. The police chief frowned, clearly irritated. "He's a general in the army, Miller, a respected officer. Do you really have no idea what you've done?" The color drained from John's face, and the confidence he had previously exhibited evaporated. "But I was just doing my job," he murmured, his voice trembling as he looked down at the floor. He was in a place he shouldn't be. I had to maintain order. You did it in an inhumane manner, the chief retorted, his voice filled with disappointment. You have no idea what you're talking about. The way you treated him is unacceptable. The room fell silent, and John felt the weight of his colleague's disapproval pressing down on his shoulders. Meanwhile, William was called in for questioning. He entered a separate room where a detective was waiting. General Davis, thank you for being here. We need to discuss what happened, the detective said, trying to be as professional as possible. Would you like to detail what occurred during the stop? William took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. I was just heading home. I was listening to music, trying to relax, and then I was stopped by an officer who began treating me like I was a criminal. His hands trembled and he felt emotion bubbling over. He handcuffed me and humiliated me in front of several people. This is something I never thought I would experience, especially in my own country. The detective listened attentively, his eyes narrowing in understanding. I'm very sorry to hear that, sir. Do you have any proof of what happened? Any videos or witnesses who could corroborate your story? There are people who filmed everything, William replied, anger beginning to transform into determination. And I want this to be addressed. I can't let this injustice go unpunished. The detective nodded. So I'll do that. We'll make sure this doesn't go unpunished. As William left the room, he felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the incident, even though he still carried the pain of humiliation. He knew the fight was far from over, but he was determined not to let John Miller's ignorance define him. Captain John Miller sat in a hard chair in the precinct's meeting room, his heart racing as the conversation around him grew increasingly tense. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. He looked at the faces of his superiors who regarded him with disapproving looks and felt a knot form in his stomach. What should have been a routine meeting had turned into a judgment tribunal. The humiliation of William Davis still echoed in his mind, but now the weight of the consequences began to feel real. Captain Miller, the police chief began, his voice firm but laden with a coldness that John was unprepared to face. Do you have anything to say about the incident that occurred yesterday? What you did was unacceptable. John took a deep breath, trying to gather his courage. I was just trying to maintain order. He was in a dangerous area, in a car that looked out of place. I couldn't just ignore that. That doesn't justify how you treated General Davis, the chief interrupted, his eyes fixed on John. You weren't just dealing with an ordinary citizen. He is a respected officer, and your approach was completely disproportionate. Feeling cornered, John tried to defend himself. But he shouldn't have been there. Look at the car he's driving. It's a sign that something isn't right. I was just doing my job. One of John's colleagues, who had remained silent until now, intervened. Your job doesn't include humiliating people, John. The way you acted was racist and unacceptable. That's not what the police should represent. Those words struck deep. He felt anger and indignation rising inside him, but at the same time there was a small voice in his head, making him feel guilty. What had he done? He looked down at the floor, his hands trembling slightly on the table. Meanwhile, at home, William was battling his own demons. The pain of humiliation was still fresh, and he could barely look at himself in the mirror. His wife, Angela, watched him with concern. Honey, you need to talk about this. You can't just keep it all inside, she said, pulling him into a deeper conversation. William sighed, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. I don't know if it's worth it. Seeking justice might just bring me more pain. What if I lose? What if this affects our family? Angela leaned closer, placing her hand over his. You can't let fear control your life. What happened to you wasn't right, and you deserve to fight for it. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been through this. I don't know if I have the strength to face this, he confessed, his voice choked. I feel like if I do something, I'll open a wound that may never heal. Then let's heal together, she replied, determined. I'll be by your side every step of the way. Back at the precinct, John was sweating. He remembered the conversation he had with his wife the night before. She doesn't understand, he murmured to himself, distressed. She doesn't know what it's like to be in my shoes. One of his superiors, noticing John's state, decided to intervene. Captain, perhaps you should consider that your actions have a greater impact than you realize. This isn't just about you. It's about community trust in us. We need to be leaders, not just in our actions, but also in our thoughts. John looked up, surprised by the sincerity of the observation. I just wanted to do what I thought was right, but now I don't know if I know what that is. Maybe it's time for you to reflect on that, the superior said, softening his tone. We all have biases. The important thing is how we choose to deal with them. You can still change, John. Those words echoed in John's mind as he wondered if there was still time for him to redeem himself. He felt lost, but at the same time a part of him wanted to be found. That night, as both men dealt with their own crises, the fates of William and John were about to intertwine in ways neither could predict. William Davis sat in a quiet cafe, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the soft murmur of conversations around him. The sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a feeling of warmth and comfort, but he couldn't shake the shadow looming over his mind. He stared at the cup in front of him, his thoughts heavy. The humiliation he suffered during the police encounter was still fresh in his memory like an open wound. His friend Sergeant Marcus Johnson arrived, bringing with him an air of determination that contrasted sharply with the sadness enveloping William. "Hey, brother, how are you feeling?" Marcus asked, pulling out a chair and sitting down. William sighed. "I don't know, Marcus. Every day feels harder. I should do something about it, but what if it affects my career? What if I can't handle the consequences?" "You have to fight, William. What happened to you wasn't just a personal offense. It's a reflection of something much larger. You know that," Marcus replied, looking William in the eyes with sincerity. "Men like John can't continue to act this way without consequence. You are an officer, and your voice carries weight." "Yes, but I'm also a man, and the thought of facing this in court, exposing everything, it's terrifying," William said, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "What if they attack me? What if the media turns me into the villain of the story?" Marcus smiled slightly, trying to ease the tension. "They might try, but you have the truth on your side. And the truth is powerful, my friend. You need to decide whether you want to be a victim or a fighter." William looked at his coffee cup, reflecting on his friend's words. "You're right, but I don't know if I'm ready for that. Part of me worries about the fallout. I really don't want my family to go through this." Concern was etched on William's face. He knew his wife Lisa had always supported him, but the idea of dragging her into such a public conflict troubled him. "What would you do in my place?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "I would fight, and I would do it for her too. Think about how many people are going through similar situations and don't have the courage to stand up. You can be their voice," Marcus said, his conviction apparent. "And remember, you're not alone. I'll be by your side no matter what happens." William took a deep breath, feeling the strength of Marcus's friendship. "Okay, I'll think about consulting a lawyer. I need to know what my options are. But at the same time, I feel like this could open a Pandora's box that I might not be able to close. Don't be afraid. Sometimes you have to confront what's hidden beneath the surface. You need to free yourself from this pain," Marcus encouraged, placing a hand on William's shoulder. "And if you decide to sue, I'll be there, not just as a friend, but as an ally. Your story needs to be told." The conversation flowed, and William began to feel a slight relief. The idea of fighting for justice, although daunting, also brought a sense of hope. "You know, Marcus, I've always tried to maintain my dignity, even in the face of humiliation. But I also can't let this happen to others. This isn't just about me." "Exactly, it's about all of us. And you have a platform, William. Use it. You are a leader, even if you don't realize it," Marcus asserted, his voice full of conviction. "And I promise I'll be with you every step of the way." William smiled, feeling determination grow within him. "All right, I'll look for lawyers and see what I can do. I can't let fear paralyze me. I need to be the change I want to see." "That's right. And remember, you're doing this for all of us," Marcus said, raising his cup in a toast. "To the fight for justice." William raised his cup as well, and in that simple gesture he felt stronger. He was ready to face whatever came next, determined to seek justice not just for himself, but for all those who, like him, had been silenced by discrimination and prejudice. John Miller sat nervously in the waiting room of the therapist's office, the soft light streaming through the windows, illuminating the space in a welcoming way, contrasted sharply with the storm he felt inside. He never imagined he would need therapy, but the mounting pressure and the fallout from his actions forced him to confront the reality he had been ignoring for so long. The door opened, and the therapist, Dr. Lisa Reynolds, greeted him with a calm smile. "Good morning, John. How are you feeling today?" She gestured for him to take a seat. "I don't know. I'm here because my wife thinks I need help," he replied, his voice hesitant. "But honestly, I don't know if this will change anything." The therapist watched him closely, taking her time to respond. It's normal to feel that way, especially when we're confronting deep issues about ourselves. Let's work together to understand this. What do you think your wife is worried about? John sighed, shaking his head. She's tired of me, I think, tired of who I am. She doesn't understand how I could have acted that way towards a man like that. And I don't understand it either. You're referring to General Davis? Dr. Reynolds asked, jotting something down in her notebook. How did you feel during that encounter? John's expression hardened and he looked away. I needed to maintain order. He was in a luxury car in an area where he shouldn't have been, but at the same time I treated him horribly. I couldn't stop my anger from taking over. Anger is a powerful emotion, John, but what fuels it? The therapist asked gently. Can you tell me more about your beliefs and how you were raised? He hesitated, staring at the floor for a moment. My parents always taught me to be suspicious of people who didn't look like me. That's how I grew up. I never thought I was wrong. But now, after what happened, I feel lost. Dr. Reynolds leaned slightly forward, encouraging him to continue. And how do you feel realizing that these beliefs have consequences? John closed his eyes, recalling the images of General Davis being handcuffed, the humiliation in his gaze. I feel ashamed. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I only caused pain, and now my life is falling apart. My wife is disappointed. My colleagues are judging me. I don't know who I am anymore. The therapist paused, allowing him to process his words. What if you viewed this as an opportunity for growth, to reevaluate your beliefs and change your behavior? What do you think you can learn from this experience? John furrowed his brow, clearly struggling with the idea. Change. It's hard. I know I'm wrong, but changing everything I've always known, it's scary. I understand. Change can be frightening, but it can also be liberating. The first step is recognizing that you have the power to choose how to react in these situations moving forward, Dr. Reynolds said in an encouraging tone. How about we start exploring what you can do to handle these emotions in a healthy way? As the session progressed, John began to open up more. He shared memories from his childhood, the difficulties he faced, and the fears he carried. With each word he felt a weight lift, but at the same time a new responsibility emerged. He was finally confronting what he had always avoided, the true nature of his beliefs. I just wanted to be a good cop, do what's right, but I ended up being everything I've always criticized, he confessed. His voice choked. How can I change that? By acknowledging your past, you've already taken a big step. Now we need to work on strategies so you can act differently in the future. Let's explore your insecurities and what it truly means to be a fair and ethical police officer, Dr. Reynolds responded as he began to feel more at ease. In another part of the city, William, now sitting at a cafe table, reflected on his own journey. He had attended a community event discussing racial equality and the fight against discrimination. The voices around him inspired him, but the pain of humiliation still weighed heavily on his heart. He looked around, observing others who had also faced similar struggles. William, would you mind sharing your story? An older woman called out to him, her gaze encouraging. Your voice is important to all of us. He took a deep breath, feeling the support of the community around him. Of course, I never thought I would be the target of discrimination, even being a military officer. But the experience with Captain Miller showed me that there's still a long way to go. We need to unite and fight for a better future, where no one is treated with disdain because of their skin color. As William spoke, his confidence grew, and he felt empowered by the solidarity he received. The contrast between John and William's lives became increasingly evident, each dealing with their own struggles, but both seeking change and understanding. John's relationship with his wife, Sarah, had become a silent but explosive battleground. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, obscuring what was once a solid love. John, sitting at the kitchen table, stirred his spoon in his cup of coffee, his mind consumed by the recent humiliation he had inflicted on William. Beside him, Sarah watched him with a look of disappointment, the tension between them palpable. You don't understand, Sarah, John began, breaking the silence. I was just doing my job. That man was in a place where he shouldn't have been. I have to maintain order. Maintain order, Sarah replied, her voice rising. You were just being racist, John. How can you not see that? You ruined a man's life because of your ridiculous beliefs. He stared at her, anger mixing with confusion. Tersai, he was driving a luxury car, Sarah. That's not normal. What am I supposed to think? What if he were a white man driving that car? Would you act the same way? Sarah questioned, her indignation rising. You can't just ignore his skin color and how you treated him. This isn't about maintaining order, it's abuse of power. John felt cornered, defensiveness creeping into his tone. You don't know what it's like out there facing criminals every day. I had to make sure he wasn't a threat. He wasn't a threat, John. He was an army officer, a respected person. You humiliated a man who was just trying to live his life, she replied, her gaze piercing. And now you refuse to see the truth. The kitchen door opened, and their daughter, Emily, walked in with her messy hair and an innocent smile. Hi, Daddy. What are you guys discussing? She looked between them, sensing the tension. Sarah quickly forced a smile, trying to maintain normalcy. Nothing, sweetheart. Just an adult conversation, John replied, attempting to hide his frustration. But Emily wasn't convinced. You guys look like you're fighting, she said, tilting her head. Is everything okay? It's fine, honey. Just a misunderstanding, Sarah assured her. But John saw the worry in their daughter's eyes. It was a painful reminder that his actions affected not just him, but his entire family. Once Emily left, Sarah turned back to John. I'm thinking about taking this to the media. What you did can't go unpunished. John was in shock. Are you crazy? That will only make things worse. I'll lose my job. He stood up, the chair creaking under the weight of his anger. You can't do this. And you think I should stay silent while you destroy a man's life? No, John, you need to understand that your actions have consequences, and I can't support this, she asserted, her voice firm. The truth needs to come out. And what are you going to do, create a scandal? Make everyone hate me? That won't help anyone, John retorted, his frustration turning to desperation. Aren't you thinking about our family? I'm thinking about what's right, John, and that's more important than any job or appearance, Sarah replied, her eyes burning with determination. If you can't see that, I don't know if I can stay here. He felt the depth of the crisis settling in his heart. The wife he had always considered his pillar was now questioning everything he represented. John had never thought his beliefs could create such a huge barrier between them. He turned away, unable to face her disappointed gaze. You don't understand, Sarah. I was taught this way. It's something I've always known, John murmured, his voice faltering. And that's why you need to change, she replied, her voice now tinged with sadness. You need to confront your prejudices and learn from them, because if you don't, you'll lose not just your job, but your family too. John took a deep breath, the reality of his actions beginning to seep into his mind. He knew that the battle he was fighting wasn't just against William, but against himself, his beliefs, and the man he had become. And no matter how hard he tried to resist, Sarah's truth echoed in his mind, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. William sat at a cafe table, the morning light filtering through the windows. He stared at his coffee cup, but his mind was far away, lost in thoughts about what would come next. After days of reflection and anguish, he had finally made a decision. He had decided to sue John, the police officer who had humiliated him so brutally. The idea of a lawsuit made him nervous, but at the same time, he felt it was the right path, not just for himself, but for everyone who faces discrimination. Are you sure about this? Asked his friend Marcus, a military officer who had always supported him. Suing a cop is a big responsibility, and you know it could impact your career. William took a deep breath, looking at Marcus seriously. I know, but I can't just stand by. What happened to me wasn't just a personal affront. It's a reflection of what many face every day. I can't let this go unchallenged. Marcus nodded, understanding the depth of William's words. If you need me, I'll be here. You're not alone in this. After their conversation, William felt strengthened. He decided to schedule a meeting with lawyers who could guide him on how to proceed. In the office, the atmosphere was austere, with white walls and dark furniture. He was greeted by a woman in a sharp suit who introduced herself as Dr. Sophia. William, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard about what happened to you. I'm sorry for your experience, she said, her voice conveying empathy. Thank you, Doctor. Sophia, he replied, his tone a mix of gratitude and determination. I'm here because I want to sue John Miller. What he did was unacceptable. The lawyer paused, observing him. I understand. We have a strong case, especially considering who you are. However, we need to make sure you're prepared for what lies ahead. This could be a long and at times painful process. William nodded, absorbing her words. I'm aware of that. I just want this to serve as an example. I can't allow people like him to continue acting with impunity. Dr. Sophia smiled slightly, admiring his determination. Let's work together to make that happen. I'll gather the necessary information and get in touch with you soon. Meanwhile, John was at home sitting in the living room in oppressive silence. The day had been tough, and the disciplinary hearing loomed ahead. He felt increasingly isolated, the consequences of his actions starting to become real. The television was on, but he wasn't paying attention to what was happening. His mind was cloudy, filled with doubts and regrets. His wife, Laura, entered the room, bringing him a cup of tea. "You need to eat something, John. What are you going to do at the hearing? Do you really think you can come out of this okay?" He looked at her, frustration evident on his face. "I don't know, Laura. Things have changed. I'm not a racist. I just didn't think. I was just doing my job." "Doing your job?" she interrupted, her voice heavy with disbelief. "What you did to William wasn't doing your job. You publicly humiliated him. No matter what you say now, people saw it." John stood up, the tension escalating between them. "And what do you want me to do? I want things to go back to normal, but I can't. I can't believe this happened." Laura shook her head, exasperated. "How you need to take responsibility, John. It's not just about you. What you did has consequences." He looked at her, realizing the truth in her words. "I'll defend myself at the hearing. I'll explain that I was just following the protocols. Protocols that you twisted to satisfy your prejudice," she replied, her voice firm. "There's no escaping what you've done. You need to face it." As John prepared for what lay ahead, William felt increasingly empowered. That day, he gathered with his community in a show of solidarity. The voices around him were encouraging, and he realized he was not alone in this fight. The decision to sue John was not just a personal matter. It was a struggle for dignity and justice that resonated in many hearts. "We're with you, William," said a woman who had faced discrimination in her own life. "Your courage inspires us." "Thank you. Together we can make a difference," he replied, feeling the energy of unity. The fight was just beginning, but William was determined not to back down. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he finally felt at peace with his decision. John Miller's disciplinary hearing was scheduled for early morning, and the room was packed. The faces were a mix of curiosity, indignation, and expectation. William Davis, dressed in a dark suit that reflected his seriousness and dignity, entered the room with firm steps. His eyes scanned the environment, recognizing many of the faces that had witnessed his humiliation. The murmur that spread among the attendees was a combination of whispers of support and disapproval, but William remained focused. John, seated at the defense table, seemed nervous. He adjusted his tie, alternating between glancing at documents and trying to avoid eye contact with we. The atmosphere was heavy, and he could feel the pressure of his colleagues and the community's gazes. The police chief stood up to commence the hearing, and a respectful silence enveloped the space. "We are here to discuss the conduct of Officer John Miller during the encounter with General William Davis," the chief began, his voice steady. "Evidence will be presented, and the consequences of his actions will be evaluated." William took the floor, his imposing presence capturing everyone's attention. "I would like to speak about what happened that day," he said, his voice resonating. "What should have been a simple police encounter turned into a public humiliation. It was not just a violation of my dignity, but a clear demonstration of prejudice." Murmurs increased among the attendees, but William continued, looking directly at John. "Some may think this isn't a big problem, but for me and many others it reflects a system that still allows discrimination to thrive." He took a deep breath, feeling the emotion rise. "I served this country, risked my life to defend it, and yet I am treated with disrespect. This is not just a personal offense. It is an offense to everyone who faces discrimination." John, at the table, seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He tried to maintain a stoic facade, but the expression on his face revealed his growing anxiety. John's lawyer stood up, attempting to shift the focus. "General Davis, are you implying that the approach was disproportionate? The officer was merely fulfilling his duty." "Fulfilling his duty?" William replied, his voice rising slightly. "Fulfilling one's duty does not mean dehumanizing someone. It does not mean ignoring the dignity of a citizen. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It is part of a culture that needs to be confronted." The hearing continued, and John's lawyer, sensing the strength of William's words, decided to change. "Let's talk about your behavior after the encounter, Mr. Davis. You didn't feel offended, rather you felt attacked, didn't you? This led you to make impulsive decisions." William didn't hesitate. "Yes, I felt attacked, but not for being approached. I felt attacked because the officer who was supposed to protect the community was more interested in reaffirming his prejudice than in doing his job. That's what I want everyone here to understand. John's gaze hardened, but he could no longer maintain. He tried to keep his composure, but the tension was palpable. Everyone present knew that the scales of justice could weigh heavily against him. He was preparing to defend himself, but with every word from William, the confidence he once had began to crumble. It's not just about me, William continued, addressing the audience. If we don't speak about this now, if we don't take a stand against racism and discrimination, we will allow it to continue. For each of us who feels oppressed, there are thousands who lack a voice. I am here today to represent all of them. The room fell silent, and the gravity of William's words hung in the air. He was not just speaking for himself, he was speaking for many who had suffered in silence. The faces around him showed a mix of support and reflection. William's words echoed in the room, and for a moment, everyone contemplated what true justice and responsibility meant. The hearing continued, but the dynamics had shifted. William was no longer just a victim, he was becoming a symbol of resistance. The tension between him and John was palpable, and everyone in the room knew that what was at stake was much more than a police officer's career. It was a matter of dignity, respect, and the ongoing fight against prejudice. John Miller's disciplinary hearing was about to begin, and the anticipation in the air was palpable. The makeshift tribunal, set up in the meeting room of the precinct, was filled with police officers, lawyers, and community members, all eager to hear the truth about what had happened that fateful night. William Davis, now a symbol of the fight against racism, sat at the front, taking deep breaths to control his anxiety. He knew that his voice was more than just a recounting. It was the chance for many who had endured the same humiliation. When the police chief entered, a reverent silence spread through the room. He positioned himself in front of the table, his expression serious. "Thank you all for being here. We are here to address a matter of utmost importance, not just for our police force, but for the community we serve," he began, looking directly at John, who was seated visibly nervous, with sweaty hands resting on the table. "Just today, we will examine Officer Miller's actions during the encounter with citizen William Davis. The evidence will be presented, and the truth will be revealed." The chief paused, allowing his words to resonate in the room. "Let's begin with the video of the encounter." The lights dimmed, and the screen illuminated the room with images of the approach. The video showed John exiting the patrol car, his posture aggressive and the scornful words directed at William. "What are you doing here, you criminal? A car like that couldn't possibly be yours." John's words echoed in the room, and the tension increased with each insult. William felt adrenaline surging through his body. He knew those words. He recognized the pain they caused. When the video ended, a murmur of indignation swept through the audience. John seemed to lose color, his gaze becoming increasingly terrified. The police chief seized the moment. "Now, I invite Mr. William Davis to speak." William stood up, his imposing figure projecting an aura of dignity. He approached the microphone, and the room fell into a deep silence. "That night was one of the most humiliating of my life," he began, his voice strong yet laden with emotion. "I am an army officer, a defender of freedom and justice, yet I was treated like a criminal simply for being a black man in a luxury car. This is not just a personal issue, it reflects a much larger problem in our society." William's words resonated through the room, and the audience was completely engaged. "I do not seek revenge, but rather the justice that has been denied to me and so many others. We must confront the racism that permeates our institutions and destroys lives. This is not just about me, but about everyone who has been a victim of prejudice." As William spoke, John appeared increasingly isolated. He looked at the colleagues who once supported him, but now their gazes were filled with reproach. "You can't just act as if there's no responsibility for your actions, John," one colleague said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. The pressure was mounting. The police chief, taking the floor again, revealed a new element that left everyone in shock. "We have received information that a video of the encounter has been leaked to the press. The footage is circulating, and the backlash is devastating for our police force." At that moment, a journalist present raised his hand. "What does this mean for Officer Miller? Will he be held accountable for his actions?" The question hung in the air, and everyone awaited the answer. "It means that the truth will be exposed and the community will know what really happened," the chief replied, with a firmness that seemed to instill hope in everyone present. When it came time for the decision, the atmosphere was tense. John, still seated, stared at the floor, unable to face reality. The police chief read the final verdict. In light of the evidence and Mr. Davis's testimony, the decision is clear. Officer John Miller is hereby dismissed from his duties and will face a criminal investigation for his actions. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers, but for William, there was a sense of relief. He had fought not just for himself, but for all who faced discrimination. As he exited the room, he was met with applause and hugs from the community that had united in support. William looked toward the horizon, feeling empowered. "This is just part of the fight," he told a group of friends surrounding him. "We must continue to fight for justice and equality." Meanwhile, John, isolated and without support, left the room burdened by a weight he never imagined carrying. He glanced back one last time, realizing that his actions had not only destroyed his career, but also his personal life. He found himself confronting the emptiness of his beliefs, learning the hard way that his attitudes have real consequences. We have reached the end of this moving story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more accounts like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Now there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these touching stories, just click on it and you'll be all set. And now tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and leave a like to support our work. Now, a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to know your opinion. Until the next video.